right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Kyle Shutt. I sit next to BJ and Steph. Hopefully you were able to join us a little bit ago for our virtual field trip where we learned all about polar bears. We went very in-depth, but if you hold on one second, I've got a computer that's open. Just close that, BJ. That should minimize the volume for us. Get a little feedback, a little echo. That's okay. Always things going on up here on the Tundra, you know?
Gotta be able to react quickly.
All kinds of tech running. So, if you weren't joining us, if you didn't join us this morning, we're here on the shores of the Hudson Bay. It's pretty remarkable. The ice is forming just outside the window. You might hear the wind in the background from time to time because it is a bit blustery today, for sure. Some snow is falling a little earlier. Looks like it's clearing out a little bit. And we've got some bears roaming around, although we don't have any to show you right now, but we're hoping that they might cruise on by here at some point. So just thought
You
we'd
might
take
see us put our binoculars to our face as we're kind of keeping an eye,
Trying to
so we
find
can
one for
spot
you.
them for you and get them on the cam.
Absolutely. Let's do real quick introductions, just let everybody know in case they weren't able to join us this morning, or perhaps you're one of those classrooms that used some of that previewing content. You were able to create your own little virtual viewing party and you're wondering, so what are we doing here, right? And if that's the case, then I want you to know a little bit about the panel and what we're doing. So as I mentioned, Discovery Education, we're the partners up here with Polar Bears International. Very thankful to be here. And we're really just trying to interact and engage and answer as many questions as possible. That's the whole goal for the next 30 minutes. So BJ.
Sure. So I'm BJ Kirchhofer, and I'm the Director of Field Operations for Polar Bears International. I get to spend a bit of time here in Churchill every year, helping kind of reach out to classrooms all over the world talking about polar bears through this type of webcast technology. But when I'm not here, I get to participate in a few of Polar Bears International's field projects, especially the ones that incorporate technology in the field to kind of answer some of these questions about polar bears.
Very cool. You've done some pretty interesting work. If we get questions about that, we'll come back to you. So, Steph, I know you've been up here before. Can you share a little bit about what your role is and what you're doing?
Yeah, hi, I'm Stephanie Penk. I'm a graduate student at the University of Toronto, and my research focuses on energetics in polar bears. So I'm trying to figure out how much energy polar bears get when they eat their food and how much energy they need to live out here on this Arctic landscape. And I was lucky enough to come up last year around this time as well and meet the lovely folks at Polar Bears International, and they were kind enough to have me up here again to talk polar bear science with you guys, and super excited to be here.
Excellent. So if you're joining us and you want to submit those questions, we of course want you to submit them. We have a bunch of questions that we just ran out of time. There was so much engagement in our earlier event, so we can come back to some of those as well. But we definitely want you to be able to submit questions in case you're just joining us. So a couple ways you can do that. First off, if you're on the Polar Bears International viewing page, of course you can use the little chat, sign in. And we have moderators there that will answer your questions as quickly as possible, and they're also passing them along to us. So thank you to the team that's helping there. Polar Bears International also has an email inbox. So if you'll submit your questions via email, send them to questions@pbears.org, and we'll capture those and we'll send them to me here as well. And then the other way that we're getting so many questions is just via social media, specifically using Twitter and that hashtag Tundra Connections. And for those Discovery Education classrooms joining us, that hashtag Celebrate with DE. And you're probably seeing the little, if you're on the Discovery Education page, the little Twitter embed roll so you can see what's coming up. So please feel free, send us those questions, and we're just going to do Q&A. No specific planned content today, but we'll go as in depth as we can, and maybe even out Google a scientist, right? We want to have you.
Yeah.
Okay.
We don't have all the answers.
Do some polar bear research on the fly, right? So a couple questions we're getting. Some questions right here from Shaker. How cold is it there? I thought that'd be a great way to start it off because it is a little chilly. Should we talk? I'll talk Fahrenheit. I'm from Pennsylvania. I'm from the States, so I try to do the conversion, but I will admit that's not my go-to. But when I woke up, I saw it was 5. I think our high is 7 today in Fahrenheit. So that would be, trying to think, probably about
Probably like minus 14, 13, something like that. C. We'll look it up right now.
0 is 32.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I kinda
minus
get stuck
18
there.
C is 0 Fahrenheit.
Yeah. So gives
somewhere
you a
in
little
there.
range.
Yeah, we're in a range.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's it's not super cold out. This is kind of where polar bears might start to begin to get a little bit more active. But
It's
for
finally
humans,
getting comfortable for the bears.
yeah, exactly. They've got a pretty thick coat on. But for humans, it's pretty chilly. You'd want to put your hat and mittens on before going outside. Yeah.
For sure. What about how many bears you've seen this year? You've seen a lot of bears, especially a couple of weeks ago. There was a bunch moving through. I know that. I don't know if you keep count on that thing, but I know there's a bunch of research going on while we're up here. Anything you can talk to as far as observations or how you track that kind of thing?
Yeah. So I guess we've seen a fair amount of bears this year. It sort of started slow, and then about a week ago, there was a fair amount of bears making their way through the Churchill area. And now, to be honest, it's sort of petered off. That's why we're having a hard time putting a bear on the camera for you today. It's, tough for us webcasters here, but it's actually really good for the polar bears. Temperatures did get a little bit cooler, and sea ice started to form on the Hudson Bay. And that, if we take a shot outside, you can see Hudson Bay is looking pretty white from our perspective. Of course, polar bears need a lot more sea ice in order to get out and truly make a living, but it's moving in the right direction for them. I don't know if, Steph, if you want to talk a little bit about just polar bear numbers as a whole.
Yeah, so last count, we for the Western Hudson Bay population, I believe there was an aerial survey, which means basically have people sitting in a plane, 2 people on each side of the plane looking out, and they're just flying a straight line and counting polar bears on each side. And there's a couple mathematics behind that to account for, if you have better vision than someone else. But using that technique, I believe we were estimating around 850 polar bears in the Western Hudson Bay. But, plus or minus a few hundred on either side, because there's not too much certainty on those estimates. Still a lot of unknowns when we do the aerial surveys, and even with the Mercury capture methods, it's still hard to get a very precise number. But we're sitting around 850.
For those students, classrooms, folks that are joining us that don't know the
Good point, Kyle. So,
can you explain a little? Yeah.
Mercury capture is another way that we can estimate population size on polar bears, and what that means is that when you capture a polar bear, we actually give it an identification number, a little tattoo numbered on the inside of their lip, or as well as an ear tag. And that allows us to know when we see that bear if we catch it again. So that's the recapture. So then you know how many bears, when you're capturing them, how many you've captured before. And again, you can do a mathematical calculation and estimate what the proportion of the population is that you've caught. So that helps us also not only get at the total population size, but we can also start to tease apart what age the population is, because when we have those bears captured, we can tell how old they are, if they're a male or a female, what their reproductive status is, so do they have cubs with them. So we get a little more information out of that method, but obviously it can be a little more time consuming. So.
Okay. Lots more questions coming in. Specifically, if you recall the Ursula video that we shared earlier today, we had a couple questions we couldn't get to during the live event as well around Ursula, and just lots of interest in that polar bear and what you saw and how you tracked Ursula and so forth. Do you know if Ursula is still alive? Kendall was just wondering, is there any more data points or?
That's a pretty tough one,
Take a peek, see if
Yeah, we can kind of look and see if her collar's still moving. I think that would be probably the best way to tell if she's still alive. Even if her collar isn't moving, it doesn't mean that she's not alive. It could mean that the collars that we put on polar bears, they have an automatic release mechanism. The batteries only last so long, just like your cell phone. Your cell phone maybe only lasts a day, but polar bear collars can last up to 2 years. So we put this little mechanism on there that when the time is up for the batteries, just about, then the collar releases, ideally on land, so scientists can go back and find it. So the collar might not be moving because the collar has fallen off. And Ursula could still be making her way out there. So I think it's a lot easier to tell probably for certainty, if she's still alive, if the collar's still moving, but other than that, it's pretty hard to tell. We'd have to get lucky and maybe recapture her.
Yeah.
Well, as Steph's, she's kind of bringing up the map here, I thought this might also provide an opportunity because some of the classrooms that are watching, they might not know about the bear tracker you have on your website, and some of those resources that they can do to start learning about specific bears. Do you want to talk a little bit about
Sure.
that?
So if you go to polarbearsinternational.org and click on the menu item that says Explore, one of the top items there will be Polar Bear Tracker. Go check that out. There's some really neat information there about specific polar bears. You can see how they move around, when they move around, on the Hudson Bay specifically. It's a pretty cool tool to sort of learn about a little bit of geography, a little bit about how animals use habitat, or polar bears specifically. So check that out.
For sure, and we had some questions around that. How big is the tundra and things like that? So I think that also, that polar bear tracker can help you to understand where the bears are roaming. Of course, it's more than just the tundra. Ideally, you're seeing them as they're getting out onto the ice, what times of year, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Polar bears don't really want to be on the tundra. Polar bears want to eat seals. We've been talking a little bit about that earlier today. There's no seals on land. There's no land seals. So polar bears want to be out on the sea ice catching those seals. And it requires that whole ecosystem. I don't know if we'll dive into it right now. I'm sure there's some questions that will ask it here in a little bit, and we can talk about kind of what makes up the entire system that makes polar bears so successful.
Well, I think that's a good transition. In fact, there's a question here. Does it look like the season is off to a good start for the ice pack? What have you observed so far?
Yeah, I think, Steph, I don't know if you want to jump in here or if you're still looking up Ursula.
I was wondering when we saw Ursula last in that video, what the date was that we're talking about in the video. Does that...
Maybe we can dig that.
know?
They found her collar on land in September, I think.
Of 2018?
So.
Okay, yeah, so I don't have
I don't know if they
updates
heard that.
on...
I want to reiterate,
Yeah.
KT's behind the scenes and she's helping out. I'm not sure everybody heard her microphone, but I think we're talking September of 2018 was the last time when they found her collar. So,
Yeah. So I don't have her after 2018, so I don't have updates, but I do have some old records of Ursula, or X33410, according to my records. But yeah, so I'll have to keep an eye out for Ursula anytime I get new data coming in from the Western Hudson Bay.
I think that's one of the neat things
Poster.
about mark recapture work is,
Yeah.
you have these individuals that are marked and they could have a story behind them. And if you do kind of pay attention, scientists want to pay attention to a particular bear, and they happen to recapture them in the future, they can tell all kinds of information. So it's kind of neat to know the individual.
Definitely.
for sure. If you have not seen the Ursula video, we encourage you take a look at that. That was part of the resources we shared on the Discovery Education page that create your virtual viewing party. And of course, Polar Bears International, you guys have it up on your site as well and your YouTube channel. So let's get back to that transition you were making about, well, I had made about ice pack, but you were starting to talk about the ecosystem.
Sure.
What's happening up here?
Yeah, so, our perspective here is from land. I think that's important to remember. And the tidal flats here are quite large. The biggest tides that the Hudson Bay sees are about now, I believe, and they're about 4.3 meters. So we're talking over 12 feet. The ocean is going to rise and fall between the tides. And because there's not much topography here, the land is really flat, in other words. If you look out, there's not many hills or anything like that. If you want to raise the water level 12 feet, that tide is going to come rolling in this huge distance. And so that whole intertidal zone is just full of ice right now, which is great. It's a good start. And it looks like even kind of beyond, more towards the horizon there's ice. So that's excellent for polar bears. That's a really good start. But of course, if we look at the sea ice maps, and I don't know, Steph, have you looked at the sea ice maps kind of recently for today? Yeah,
I know that
I
they're
didn't.
still under 30%, and I don't know if you want to...
I'll let you
Talk
take
about
that if you
one.
want to talk
Yeah.
about it.
So when we think of sea ice for polar bears, it's not just about how much area the sea ice is covering in the ocean. It's also about how thick that is and how much of a small area that ice is actually covering. So when we talk about percentage of sea ice, we're talking about maybe a 25 by 25 kilometer square. So 50 by 50 feet.
More than that, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, guys, my conversion is
It's all right.
not great.
Yeah.
But basically, you're looking at a small square, and you decide if 30% of that square is covered by ice, and if it is, that square gets a 1. And so you do this over a much bigger area, and then you decide if that larger area is 30% covered. And that's when we find is a critical threshold for polar bears. So if the ice is 30% concentration out there, they're going to start getting out there, start using it, because it means they don't have to swim that much in between ice patches. And swimming can be really, really energetically costly for polar bears. It's up to 5 times more energy to swim from point A to point B than it is for them to walk. So it's a really energy balancing act as the polar bear lifestyle. So it's important to keep that in mind.
Well, thank you for continuing to submit questions. Miss Briggs' third grade students, they have a lot of questions. We'll try to answer a couple of them here for you guys. Thank you for continuing to send them in. Do the polar bears swim in lakes? That's an interesting question, right? Because we're talking about swimming. Although you don't want them to be swimming, usually when you think about them swimming, it's out in the bay.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't think they're going to come across too many lakes. I don't know, BJ, if you know, and when they're on land, is there many lakes close? Maybe rivers?
I mean, they could. I think anything's possible. You're a very large animal. You're not worried about too much out here as far as other animals are concerned. I think if maybe if it's a pretty warm day, and they want to get away from bugs here in the Hudson Bay, potentially during summertime, maybe they would go for a swim. We work with a scientist that's built a collar cam, so it's like a GoPro for polar bears, and they were able to outfit a few polar bears kind of nearby here, and we got to see them, and it was pretty unusual behavior, I think. Not necessarily for polar bears, but I think it's just unusual for people to see the behaviors that we saw. A polar bear crashing through a forest. It's not something that you may kind of think. And I'm not sure if we saw any bears swimming in lakes necessarily. I wouldn't say it's impossible.
No.
But again, it's not something maybe that...
they can do it.
They can.
Whether or not they are doing it that often, I think, as VJ mentioned, if they're overheating, they're really adapted to this cold climate, so it's actually more of a problem for them to keep cool in the summertime than it is to keep warm in the winter. And we will see them go and lay down in the water. So whether or not that's fresh water or they're doing it in Hudson Bay, but they do use that to keep their core cool.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, speaking about the bears and keeping warm and cool, question about their fur. Do polar bears shed their fur? Oliver wanted to know.
I don't know the answer to that right off the top of my head.
So they do. We do see there is some shedding or hair loss inside the polar bear dens. Some of the studies that we do with PBI is actually look at, and others as well, Norwegian Polar Institute, San Diego Zoo Institute for Conservation Research, and BYU. We've done some looking at polar bear dens both in Alaska and in Norway. And when you actually have the opportunity to crawl around in a polar bear den, it's pretty wild. But their hair freezes to the snow walls inside of that den, and so they do lose their hair that way. We think they go through an annual molt. I don't know a lot about it, although we're working with a student from the University of Washington that's looking into that. So I think maybe the takeaway there is there's still things we don't know about polar bears, and there's people looking into it to try to answer some of these questions.
Excellent. More questions coming in. Third graders that want to know, how much do polar bears eat in one day?
So that's a bit of a tricky question. Like we were talking about, polar bears like to be out on the sea ice, and that's where they catch seals to eat. So when we think about polar bears, it's not so much what they eat every day, because they have this feast or famine lifestyle. And what I mean by that is when they're out on the ice, they're trying to catch a seal every week. And I mean, when they sit down, they can put 100 pounds of blubber in one sitting. So then they're good for a couple days, right? They're not going to use all that fat, but they need to pack on a lot of fat stores so that when they come back onto the shore, they can use those fat stores to stay alive because they won't be eating here. There's no significant source of energy when they're waiting on shore in the summer. So it's variable, to say the least, how much they're going to eat in a day.
Speaking about the bears, Ms. Norman would like to know in her class how many bones and organs are in a polar bear. Now that's an interesting one, counting up all of the bones and organs. That seems like maybe a good fact check search, but I don't know. I figured we'll throw it out there. Maybe you've thought about that before.
You know what? Why don't we have a Google race? I'll see if I can find the answer before your classroom does, but let me start looking.
Okay, yeah, that was pretty interesting. So, BJ, let's talk a little bit about, there's another question here about just the decline in the species themselves. And the specific question is, what is the exact reason for the 50% decline in polar bears? So I guess first let's quantify it. Is that factual, the 50% decline? Do you know, have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the important thing is there's 19 different subpopulations of polar bears, and these could be all across the circumpolar, so that's everywhere up north. And with 19 different subpopulations, there could be 19 different stories. And some of those stories we know a lot about, and some of them we don't know a lot about. Western Hudson Bay, where we are right now, there's been a ton of research that's been going on here for decades. And so we know a lot about the polar bears here because of some dedicated researchers coming out year after year and studying these bears. And then those dedicated researchers passing their techniques and training the next generations of students, and then those students training the next generation. So it's really, that's why we know so much about this population in particular and a few other populations around the world. So here in Western Hudson Bay, we know a few things. We know that we've lost about 30% of the bears over 30 years. We also know that these bears have lost about 10 days, 6 to 10 days of sea ice per decade. And so that's the reason for the decline. With less time on the sea ice, they have less time to get to the seals, their favorite food, and ultimately the number of polar bears will decrease with less sea ice.
Sure. Well, speaking of that, there's a lot of questions thinking about the ice, the food source being seals, and just the whole connected ecosystem. One of the questions here, do you track the seal populations when you consider their food sources, since you would also have to assume, at least, that there might be some sort of a correlation there or causation?
So Polar Bears International isn't tracking the seal population closely. There are some people doing seal work, but I think it's important to remember that polar bears are difficult to study, but they're far easier to study than seals. At least polar bears live on top of the water. They live on the sea ice, or they come ashore in this population anyways. And, they're in a predictable place. Seals are out on the sea ice. They're trying to stay hidden from the polar bears. Of course, they do have to come to the surface and breathe. They breathe oxygen, just like you and I. But, trying to count something that's underwater and gives birth to their young, ideally, from their perspective, underneath kind of shelves and snow inside these dens, make them very difficult to count. So I don't have an answer for you, but maybe.
Yeah, no, that, as BJ said, particularly difficult to study when you're already dealing with all the harshness of the Arctic environment, and then your study species is underneath the ice for most of the time. But there have been some literature, some research that has come out a long time ago, actually, where they do notice that the polar bear population size does directly track the growths and declines in the ring seal population. So we know, of course, that they are very reliant on one another and they affect one another. So we are trying to learn more about the seal population, but still trying to develop new techniques to really understand what their numbers are doing.
From my perspective as the educator here, I also think that brings some hope, right? Because sometimes you're sitting there as a student, right, and you're wondering, well, we know everything. What else could we learn? But I think that right there shows that this is evolving, and we need more people to put their smart brains on what the challenges are and how we can come up with solutions. Maybe it's a technological solution. You think about these trackers that humans wear to track our fitness. How do you make that analogy to bears or even to seals under the water and things like that? So it's kind of an interesting dynamic, and we hope that you'll continue to learn more, and who knows, maybe you'll come up with that solution. So
Exactly.
more questions. I don't think you guys are going to hear this, but Mrs. Meyer, thank you so much for sending. We have a little video question here, so we'll see if the team can hear. This is from fourth graders at Fritz Elementary. So give us just 1 second. We're going to listen in, and I'll try to start this again.
Hi, I'm Liam, and I'm Brady, and we're in fourth grade from Fritz Elementary School in Pennsylvania, and we want to know how long a polar bear's lifespan is.
Ooh, that's a good
Liam
question.
and Brady want to know how long a polar bear's lifespan is. Hi, guys. Thanks for watching.
Yeah,
We're
thanks
really
for
happy you
watching.
joined. Sending the video. How cool is that? I
Yeah,
love that.
super cool. Looks like a beautiful day there
It
in
does.
Pennsylvania.
Blue skies.
Yeah.
A little different weather.
So the oldest polar bear that we know of was Debbie, and she had a great healthcare plan. Debbie lived in the Winnipeg Zoo. She had vets taking care of her, and so she lived to be 42 years old, which is really, really old for a polar bear.
It's very old.
Uh-huh. I don't know, Steph, you're probably seeing some numbers in the
that's-
data that you dig into.
It's probably about double the average that we see in wild polar bears. As BJ mentioned, these guys living out in the wild don't have the diet plan and veterinary health plan that Debbie did. So we see bears get into their 20s quite regularly, though. So around maybe 25 is when we'll see most polar bears ending their lifespan. But, you know, it ranges a lot. We lose a lot of polar bears when they're younger. So cubs and yearlings, they kind of have these higher mortality rates. But once a polar bear reaches adult age, their survival is very high. So they will get into their early 20s. Yeah.
So if you can make it to be an adult polar bear, your chances of survival are quite high.
Exactly. Yeah. Once you get that far, you're looking pretty good as long as you can get sea ice and seals.
Along those lines, here's a really interesting one. Tristan wanted to know, do polar bears catch diseases as often as humans, or do they fight sicknesses? And I know you were sharing with me last night a little bit about not diseases per se, but things that polar bears acquire and so forth, like worms, right?
Yeah, wormy bears. So typically we don't see a lot of sick polar bears, but I mean, that's often the case. If they're sick, we're probably not going to make it back to shore. They're probably not going to come up in our mark recapture studies, right? But historically, we thought polar bears were pretty parasite-free, disease-free. But now we know that they are dealing with certain parasites, and one in particular that I focus on is what's called a trichinella, and that's a worm. So you know when you deworm your dog, that's basically what you're preventing your dog from getting. And polar bears will, almost 50% of adult bears can have these worms, and they don't seem to be very affected by them. But we do know that parasites steal your energy. They're using their host, the polar bear's energy. So if we have bears that are already kind of short on food, we could find that these parasites might have an impact on their survival.
Interesting work there, especially to me, again, it's that thread of new information that you discover and you think you know something, and then it changes your outlook. So really, really fascinating perspective. Just a couple more minutes here. Thank you again for all of you out there that are sharing questions. We've just received so many. We also received a bunch of questions earlier today that I just want to come back to a couple of those. Just back to the polar bear populations and tracking. So we just talked a little bit about how long they live, but do we know how many polar bears remain in the world? And then based on that, how many, what's the percentage that they're tracking? I thought that was kind of an interesting perspective of how many bears are there compared to how many you're able to follow.
Yeah.
That's pretty fascinating. That's a good question.
I can't tell you about the percentage.
I won't make you do the math right now.
But I believe the last estimates put the global population of polar bears, so all those 19 subpopulations, somewhere between 20, somewhere around 20,000 polar bears. And I'm not too sure how many of those we are tracking. Again, as BJ mentioned, Western Hudson Bay seems to be, or is the most heavily studied population because it's one of the most southern ones, and the bears come ashore and we can access them. There's some populations that are very remote and we still don't know very much about. They might not even have collared one from that population, so our subpopulation.
Yes,
Maybe.
so I think just about the collars themselves, the collars are quite expensive.
Yeah.
So the collars, they're about $3,000 a piece per collar. And then the satellite service, it's almost like your cell phone. You got to pay every month, to receive service. The satellite service is something like $3,000, or last I heard was around $3,000. So it's almost
a year or total lifespan?
Yeah, a year, I believe. So you're talking $6,000 per bear to study, and then plus you have to get all your stuff and go find the bears. I mean, they're pretty expensive to study.
Drop a collar, you have to find that collar, go out and try to
Ideally,
retrieve it.
yeah.
Or you just lose it.
Or you lose it, you lose that collar. Any collars that are found can be refurbished by the manufacturer, but not very many of them do get picked up again. So it's
Easy to drop into the water, I bet.
yeah, totally. So it's it's not inexpensive work to be working with polar bears. I think we'd like to have more collars or some sort of transmitter on bears so we understand how they move and how they use their habitat. But of course, it's not easy work and it's quite expensive.
And it's interesting. The radio collars. We can only use them on female bears.
That's good. Yeah.
Yeah. So male polar bears actually have such a thick neck that it's larger than their head. So if you try to put a collar on them, it just slides right off and over their heads. So it wasn't until very recently that there's been some technology advances that have allowed us to start looking at where male polar bears are going. I don't know if you can see.
Yeah, so Polar Bears International is working with 3M, a corporation out of St. Paul, Minnesota, to see how we can figure out how to stick these smaller transmitters onto polar bears. So the new ones, they're quite small. They're maybe about the size of my thumb here, and they're very light. They last about 270 days. But we're looking for a good way to stick these things onto polar bears. So we decided to engage 3M, and they were willing to work with us, which is really great. And we posed it to their engineers. Would you glue it on a polar bear? Would you use some sort of tape? Would you use some sort of like sticky, almost Velcro sort of thing? And so we're waiting to hear back on what their engineers are going to suggest. So we're pretty excited for that because it would allow us to tag and track male bears and figure out where they go, and maybe even some younger bears too, some subadult bears.
They are the adhesives experts. So.
They are the glue. They make things stick there at 3M. So we're really excited to be working with them on this project.
That's funny. Excellent. Well, I do want to say hello to MRS Page in Cary, North Carolina. You asked for a shout out, so hello. Just glad you're joining us. And I hope that I spelled that or said that correctly, but thank you so much. So that's lots of great questions. We hope that you'll continue to join us. We're about out of time here, but again, tomorrow we'll be joining and coming right back live with our virtual field trip. And then, of course, we'll have a Q&A panel. So if you think of more questions or maybe you get the answer to what you're looking up, I don't think Steph had a chance to figure that out. So maybe you can share that, tweet that to the Tundra Connections hashtag. We'll see whether Steph can tweet the answer or you can first. But
Science me.
there you go. But we hope that you'll join us tomorrow. Please welcome and pass the word. Maybe you have a colleague, maybe you have some friends, maybe someone else that is interested, engaged, wants to learn more about what's happening up here. That's the goal. Please, we rely on you to get the word out. So thank you so much for all of your enthusiasm about learning about bears and the impact that this environment up here, frankly, has in the direct connections to your homes. So any last thoughts or comments, guys?
Great questions. Thanks everybody for being engaged today, and definitely stay tuned. We're going to be here all day tomorrow to hang out with you and answer more questions. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. Look forward to seeing you all again, and hopefully we can answer a few more questions and get your feedback on the answers we couldn't find.
All right, that's a wrap.